Today's daf we're going to be learning is about Zarah daf kaf. We're going to get started from the Mishnah at the bottom. The ein osim tachshitim la'avodah zarah. We're just going to review the Mishnah that we started yesterday. We can't create jewelry. You can't make jewelry, fashion jewelry for idols, which makes sense, right? We talked about chokers and all sorts of jewelry. Rabbi Eliezer Omer b'sachar mutal. He says if you get paid for it, you can. Which, like I said, Tosfot and others don't have this girsa, and I think in the Yerushalmi it doesn't even appear. It doesn't make much sense why you should be able to get money for doing this kind of thing. You shouldn't be allowed to do it at all. And they take it out to figure out how those who don't take it out understand Rabbi Eliezer. But it's not going to interest our Gemara. We're going to move on to the next topic. It's a very interesting topic, which is the prohibition, which we're going to get to right away in the Gemara. What is the prohibition? But the prohibition, the basis of the Mishnah, which is not really the discussion in the Mishnah, based is this prohibition to sell land to Gentiles in Israel, okay, which we'll discuss in a minute. But let's take it right now as a given, like the Mishnah does, because it's forbidden to sell land to them. It's also forbidden to sell anything attached to the ground. Okay, that's treated like land. So in which case, so you can't sell them anything that's attached to the ground. But Rabbi Meir says, or Tanakama, which we'll see is Rabbi Meir, but if you detach it from the ground, then you can sell it. That's not a problem. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, Mochero amanat lakos. Forget it. You don't even have to detach it from the ground. You can just sell it for the purposes of cutting it. And you can assume, this is going to be the big issue, or maybe it isn't between them. Are we concerned that the Gentile might not be being honest and they'll say they're going to cut it, but they won't actually cut it in the end? So the Tanakama, which is Rabbi Meir's opinion, is that you can't sell it to them unless it's actually cut, because who knows if they're going to detach it or not. But Rabbi Yehuda trusts them. If the sale is this, then the sale is that. If you say, I'm going to sell it so that you cut down the tree, we're going to assume they're going to cut down the tree. We're going to end today's daf with a question. If you remember, you can't sell them large animals because of the concern that they're going to use the animals to work. And then again, once they sell, it's actually fine. But if you were rented, it would be a problem because your animal will work on Shabbat. But then we had a whole thing. If you sell the animal for being slaughtered, or it's clear they're going to slaughter it, then it would be permitted. So what if you sell it with the condition you're going to slaughter it, that the Gentile's going to slaughter it? Would that be permitted? Because then there's no reason for the Gzera anymore. It has nothing to do with doing work on Shabbat. So with the animal working for the Gentile on Shabbat, because they're not buying it for working purposes. So we're going to see, do they have the same machloket there? Is it the same issue? Is it all just, which would be really, why am I mentioning this now? Because it highlights the issue. Is the issue lack of trust, or is it something particular in this case and not necessarily applying to the case of the animals? And then when we get to the end of the daf, we'll discuss that issue. Is this a basic disagreement about trust in Gentiles? And if you make a sale for a particular condition, can you assume the condition will be fulfilled? Which could be a specific Gentile issue, or it could be in general an issue. Can you sell something and believe the person who's buying it? It's not so clear that they're suspicious of the people just because they're Gentiles, but it's possible, considering the way that they um, relate to the Gentiles of their time. Again, remembering that in general, this issue, why is this an issue? Well, we'll see right now. Maybe I'll just read and then we'll talk about it, which is the first words of the Gemara, Menani Mili. Where do we get this from? There's even an issue to sell land to Gentiles. Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina da Amar Kra lo techanem, which we interpret as lo titan lem chanaya b'karka. We're not allowed to give them any stronghold in the land. Okay, so let's read this pasuk and understand its context, and then maybe that will help us understand better what's going on here. So the context of this pasuk, it's very in chapter 7, verse 2. And the context here is when you get into the land, you have to kill the people in the land. Destroy everything. Lo tichrot lahem brit, don't make any sort of covenant with them. Velo techanem, and don't techanem, which again is interpreted here as don't give them any stronghold in the land, don't sell them land so that they stay there. Now, you have to remember, this isn't any Gentile. This is the 7 nations who are in the land, who are known to be steeped in all sorts of bad behaviors. And the whole reason is, right, part of it is uprooting evil, and the other part is to ensure that the Jews don't copy their ways. Okay, and we're going to see three different prohibitions that come out of this same pasuk. And they're all related to really that we don't want, if they have a stronghold in the land, they'll be living next to us. We will learn from their actions. And likewise, all the other things that we're going to talk about here are going to create more relationships between Jews and Gentiles, which will enable us to learn from their actions. And the concern is that these are terrible people, and we don't want to learn from their actions. Again, this always begs the question, which comes up in practically, I would say, every sugya in Avodah Zarah, who are we talking about here, right? This prohibition is specifically for the 7 nations. So it seems like this issue is a particular related issue to idol worshippers, perhaps just the 7 nations, right? It might be limited and not across the board to any Gentile that we come in contact with in our lives. So again, let's go back to the psukim. So the pasuk says, "Lo techanem," don't give them chanaya. Chanaya nowadays is parking, right? Any sort of the Hebrew translation is the word I can think of is kviut, which is permanence. Don't give them permanence in the land. Hi, lo techanem. Wait a minute. Don't you need the pasuk lo techanem for something else? Mebaile dahachi kamar rachmana. Lo titen lehem chen. It's an interesting one. Techanem, not michanaya, permanence, but chen. Don't give them compliments. Don't say, wow, did a great job. Wow, you're so beautiful. Wow, you're so smart. Don't compliment them because what do compliments do? Again, they increase, right? They solidify relationships, they create connections, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So now we say, but that's the explanation of this pasuk, not the first explanation. So they say, not classic. We can learn two things from here. Why? Im ken lemakra lo tichonem, my lo techanem shma min atarte. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the literary, like the how exactly we get it from the words and why tichonem is different than techanem. It's a good question. I don't have a really good answer for it. They seem to be playing with words here, but they usually seem convinced if we say it could have been worded this way and we're going to word it that way, then it must mean more than one thing. We're actually going to get to 3 in a minute, which also begs the question how exactly they're getting this from the words. Okay, shmamina. So shmamina tarte. You can learn 2 things. They say still, how can you say lo tchane means chanaya, and how can you say it means chen, akad, or really chanaya? Because let's say chen, okay, we got, and maybe we can get 2 things, but akad to mebayale, rachman. But there's another drasha here. The Torah said, lo titen lehem matnat chinam. Don't give them free gifts for nothing. Okay, you can't give these. Okay, again, which category of Gentiles we're talking about, but you can't give them gifts for free. Now, interesting interpretations here, which is what does it mean, a manat chinam? Manat chinam is something you don't plan to ever get anything in return for. So some people claim this is not applicable for, forget about which Gentiles it's applicable to, but it's not applicable to anyone who you know, who's your neighbor, who you have some relationship with, because there's no such thing as a manat chinam. Because if you give a gift to someone, eventually they'll return it to you. So it's not actually a free gift. It's a good concept about gifts, right? You think you're doing something nice to someone and it's purely, right, just to help them. But in the end, really, you have a little bit of a selfish motivation in there because in the end, if you did something for them, you'll be able to get a favor back from them one day. So that what we're talking about here, according to them commentaries, it would have to exclude that case, which would mean it limits giving a gift for no reason to some random person that you'll never see again in your life, which doesn't happen very often that you're in a situation like that where you would give them a nachinam, which kind of makes this halacha not so useful in many situations or not so relevant. Anyway, it's an interesting thought to think about. Is there such a thing as a manachinam to someone you know? So anyway, we're really learning it from there. So im ken lemaka lo tichinem. My lo tichanem shmamina kulhu. So again, it could have said tichanem, it could have said tichinem. The fact that it says tichanem teaches you all 3 things. Again, I can't exactly explain to you how exactly they get this from the words. Tanya nami hachi. Now here's a braita to support these 3 prohibitions, all coming from the same pasuk. Lo techinem, lo titen lem chanaya b'kalka. Davar acher, lo techanem, lo titen lem chen. Davar acher, lo techanem, lo titen lem anat chinam. There you have all 3, okay, in a braita. So this supports, right, the Gemara said there's all 3, but now we actually have a braita to support this point that they're all 3. Now we want to go into some of them. So we're going to start with, we're actually going to all of them. We're going to start specifically with matnat chinam. And the Gemara is going to tell you that, by the way, this Ishur Manach Chinam, forget about the fact that I said it's somewhat limited, but it's actually a debate among Tanaim about whether you can give a Manach Chinam or not. The fact that we said now you can't give a Manach Chinam, and that's what lo techanem means, not everybody agrees. And it's going to be based on a different interpretation. It's going to be based on an interpretation of a different verse in the Torah. So now we're going to see it's machloket tanaim, matnach chinam gufa tanai. It itself is a topic of a subject of debate. Detanya. Lo tochlu kol nevela. It's a very famous pasuk. You're not allowed to eat non-kosher meat. What are you supposed to do with your non-kosher meat? Right, non-shechted meat. Animal just dies, let's say, or wasn't shechted properly. What do you do with it? The Torah tells you what you do with it. Okay, one pasuk says la kelev tashlichu noto. Okay, give it to a dog. But this pasuk says Lo tochlu kol nevela. Okay, this pasuk is in Devarim Yudalit, pasuk kaf aleph. Lager asher b'sharecha titnena va'achala o machor lenochli. So give it to the ger that's in your gates. Ger here doesn't mean person who converted completely to Judaism. It means a ger toshav. It's a Gentile who's living among you. Usually it's interpreted as someone who keeps the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. So give it to a ger. Now notice it says titain. Titain is a gift. Okay. Oh, machor lenochli, or sell it to a Gentile. Now, notice it says lenochli, right? Sell it to the Gentile. It doesn't say give it as a gift. That would seem to support the reading that you can't give them gifts. But this Braita right now says, the ger b'mechira minayin. Now, if you notice, sorry, I skipped a line. Right? What this pasuk teaches you is there's two parts of the pasuk. One is give it to a ger as a gift. The other is sell it to a Gentile. So it sounds like from the simple reading of this pasuk, right, each one has a different way of dealing with it. You can't sell to a ger, you have to just give it to him as a gift, and you can't give it as a gift to the Gentile, you have to sell it to the Gentile. Well, that's not what the Braita is going to say, though. Leger b'mechira minayin. How do we know that you can actually sell it to the ger? And then we're going to say, how do you know you can actually give it as a gift to the Gentile? And then this opinion is obviously going to be the tannaitic opinion that actually permits it. So Talmud lomar titnena o machol. Notice how the pasuk works. It says, now we have to read a careful reading of the pasuk, which we didn't do the first time. Okay, don't eat any nevela. Fine, that we're going to leave aside. That's obvious. Lagil asher b'sharecha, to the ger in your courtyard. Titnena, give it. Ve'achala, and then the ger can eat it. O machor lenochli, or sell it to a Gentile. Now, if you notice the order of the pasuk, it doesn't say, it's not parallel. It doesn't say lager titnena v'lenochli timkerena. Right? That would be very parallel. It would say for the ger you do this, for the Gentile you do that. Instead, it's like an ABBA. It doesn't do ABAB. It goes lager, sell it, give it, or sell it to the Gentile. So if you put the comma in a different spot and you say to the ger, give it or sell, and then you say, or give or sell to the Gentile, right? Theoretically, you could do that because both verbs, to say it in the simplest way, both verbs are in the center and both nouns are on the sides. So perhaps both verbs go with each noun, and that's what this opinion is going to say. So how do you know lager b'mechira? Because it says tinena o machol, and then only after that says lenochli. And lenochli b'netina minayin Talmud lomar tinena b'chala o machor lenochli, because you could really read it as one continuum, right? So you can connect both verbs with both nouns. Nimtza ta'omeo. So from here you can derive, this is the Braita speaking still, echad ger ve'echad nochli, bein b'netina, bein b'mechira divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you can do both regarding both of them. So if you want to not give it as a gift and you want to sell it to the convert, go for it. If you want to give it as the Gentile as gift to the Gentile as gift, you can. What do you see from here? Rabbi Meir thinks not lo techanem. Okay, that lo techanem must mean the other things, but it doesn't mean you can't give them a gift. Rabbi Yehuda omer dvarim kichtavan lager b'nitina v'lenochli b'mechira. Rabbi Yehuda says, look at what it says. It says, who cares the ABBA? It says A, right? AB, and then it says BA. There's an O in the middle. The O cuts it into the way we would have read the pasuk in the very natural manner, which is there's two possibilities. One is for the ger, give it to the ger as a gift. The other is for the Gentiles, sell it. You can't give it as a gift, and you can't sell it to the ger. Okay. So now they say Shaper Kama Rabbi Meir. Interestingly, they think that Rabbi Meir has a good proof because they do say otherwise you really would have made it parallel. Give it to the ger, sell it to the Gentile, or to the ger, give to the Gentile, sell. So Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lecha, Rabbi Yehuda could answer you like this: Isa kadata kedkama Rabbi Meir. If really Rabbi Meir was right, lichta rachmana titnena va'achala umachol. Give it, they'll eat it, and sell it, right? Because often "and" really means "or." Oh, lamali, why did it need that extra word "oh"? It's not really necessary. It must be a separator. Shmamina lidvarim kitavanu da'ata. And that's how Rabbi Yehuda could answer the question, which is the word "oh" really is a separator. And it's not such a necessary word. It would have been very clear if we had said, give it and sell it. Really, the "and" would really mean "or," and it would be obvious. The word "oh" must be there to separate and say, this is where the pasuk breaks. And therefore, or the Gentile has its own possibility, which is only to sell, not to give it as a gift. Now they say for Rabbi Meir, so what's Rabbi Meir going to do with that? Oh, he does say, you're right, it's unnecessary, but it's actually there to teach something else. The O is there to separate, to say there's two possibilities, which are really four possibilities, but you're better off if you have an Avela. The ideal is give it to a Ger Toshav as a gift. Less ideal, sell it to a Gentile, okay? But really, we'd much rather you give it as a Ger, as a gift, than sell it to the Gentile. For Rabbi Yehuda, what's he going to say? Isn't it true? Doesn't he agree that this is just giving you the order of what's preferred? Well, he says the following. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that. It's obvious that the ideal is to give it to the ger toshav as a gift rather than give it to the Gentile, rather than sell it to the Gentile. And of course, rather than give it to the Gentile. Why is that? I don't need a pasuk. I don't need the O to teach me that, which means, again, the O is the separator. And then each one has its own verb connected with it, and the two don't overlap. כיוון דגר אתה מצווה להחיותו, ונוכלי אתה מצווה להחיותו, להקדים לא צריך קרא. Because for a ger, you're actually commanded, if a ger is suffering, you're right, or fell into a pit, you're supposed to take them out. But you don't actually have a commandment to do that with a Gentile. So because you're commanded to do that to a ger, not a Gentile, to help them survive, then obviously if I have an avela, and I can give it to someone who's needy, right, I should give it as a gift, I should gift it to ger. It's obvious. I don't need the word "oh" to tell me, oh, wait, you should know the first part of the pasuk is more important and more valuable to do than the second part. It's just intuitive, and it's based on other halachot that we know, and therefore I don't need a pasuk. That whole topic of, that you don't have to save a Gentile is a good question. Again, it begs the question of what kind of Gentiles are we talking about? Are we talking about evil people? Are we talking about all Gentiles? If we're talking about all Gentiles, it becomes more complicated. If we're talking about specifically those steeped in evil, then it's more easy to explain. Davar acher. So what we did in terms of now, we started with what's the source for the halacha, and really the base halacha in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is already based on some other halacha of lo techanem, don't sell them land. From there, we get into this machloket. First of all, we jump from land to anything attached to the land, and then we deal with things attached to the land. Can you sell them only if they're detached, or even if you make an agreement that if they're detached? But what the Gemara is going back to is the real basic, and only at the end of the daf we're going to get to that machloket Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. But right now we're just talking about the base halacha of how do we know you can't sell them land, and that's lo techanem. But wait, doesn't it mean also don't give them compliments? Doesn't it also mean don't give them gifts for free? In the end, we explained it means all three of them. And then we went into the last one about giving gifts. Happens to be a tannaitic debate. Not everyone agrees that it's forbidden. Now we're going to go back to the middle position, the middle isur, which is don't compliment them. Davar acher, lo techanem, lo titen lem chen. Misayel Rav. This halacha supports what Rav says. Da'amar Rav, asur l'adam shiomar kama na'a goyazo. A man is not allowed to say, or anyone's not allowed to say, wow, what a beautiful woman that Gentile woman is. Be the same thing, giving a compliment. Metive, they say, wait a minute, you can't say that. It's going to be interesting. We're going to see two rabbis who actually said that about a Gentile woman, which is a little strange in and of itself, which the Gemara is going to go into. What do you mean? What were they doing looking at these women? Not allowed to look at women. That's where the Gemara is going to go. But let's start with the Metive. Masev Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, not just any rabbis, but Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and then we're going to see Rabbi Akiva. Each of them, so his story was Hayal Gabe Ma'ala B'Har. He was on a stair in Har V'ra'ah Goya Achad Na'abi Yoter. He saw this beautiful Gentile woman. Amar Marabu Ma'asech Hashem. He said, "Wow, how beautiful your ways, God, your creations, God. Look at you created this beautiful woman." V'af Rabbi Akiva, Eshet Tornus Rufus Harashad. This is a crazy story. Tornus Rufus, if you remember, is the Roman officer who ends up getting Rabbi Akiva killed. Okay, so he sees Tornus Rufus's wife. Rak Sachak Ubacha. He spit at her, he laughed, and then he cried. Okay, what is this all about? Rak Shaita Ba'amiti Pasrucha. He spit at her because he was amazed by her, and then he said, well, look, all she did was come from a gross, a rotten drop of semen, basically. And this could be, tipas rucha because she's a Gentile, but likely, and some of the commentaries say this, right? Everyone comes from a tipas rucha, and he's just saying, she's human like the rest of us, and just came from a seed of just like a, what do you call it? How do you say it? Tipas rucha, a rotten seed of. Right. It's also, you're right. Thank you, Miriam. It's in Pirkei Avot that we all come from tipas rucha, okay, from just a seed of semen. Sachak. He laughed because he realized, somehow he realized, I don't know, Ruach HaKodesh, that she in the future is going to convert and he's going to marry her. It's a crazy story. Okay, apparently she converted. She asked him, why'd you spit? And then he told her, and then according to the story, she basically ends up converting, and then he ultimately marries her. Crazy story to think about. And bacha, why? Dahai shufra bale afra, because he said this beauty is going to just go into, goes with that Pirkei Avot about the pasrucha, and then we all just end up going back to the ground, okay? And this beauty is just going to be gone. So now, what do you see here? He was amazed by her beauty. And yes, what happened to Rachel, his wife? That's why this whole story is a little crazy. I mean, people did marry two wives. Maybe she was dead by then. I don't know the whole source of the story. It definitely begs a whole bunch of questions. Maybe that's why Tornus Rufus got him executed in the end. It's hard to, I don't know where, there's a lot written about this, and you can research it. I didn't have a chance. Okay, now we get back to our topic. So how did these rabbis give these compliments to these beautiful women when it says you can't? So the Rav, now this is an interesting Girsa issue. Either they're saying, how do you explain Rav in light of these statements? And we're now going to explain Rav in light of these statements. Some people have the Girsa Rabbanan, the rabbis, meaning Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva, because they're the ones we really need to explain. Although this was brought as contradiction to Rav. So in a sense, you could also say, how could Rav have said that when we see these rabbis that do it? So Rav Odu Yehuda Kamodin. These rabbis were really just thanking God for, wow, God, what have it's amazing what you've done. To Amar Mar, as it said, so if you see amazing creatures, which could be animals, could be humans, could be anything you see, but it's something beautiful that was created, special bracha that you say. And therefore, what they were doing is, particularly, you see this from Shimon Gamliel, because he said, Marabu Ma'asech Hashem. Rabbi Akiva, it's a little hard to see it. But what they were really, when they were marveling at the beauty, they were marveling at God and saying, God, wow, you've made amazing creatures in this world, or amazing people in this world, or amazing. Okay, what you created is amazing. And therefore, it wasn't a compliment to the person. Remember, the whole issue is we don't want to create relationships. Of course, what happens in the end, Rabbi Akiva ends up marrying her. Maybe this proves the point that by complimenting, you end up creating relationships. I mean, it was okay because she converted, but anyway, he didn't really say it to her face, so it's not exactly the same thing. Now the Gemara is going to ask the obvious question, which is, what were these rabbis doing looking at women? Listikule mishare, is it permitted to look at the women like this? Meitive. We're going to bring a contradictory source. V'nishmarta mikol davarha. Okay, you have to understand the context here. This is when you go out to war, you should be concerned for any bad thing that might happen. It's in Devarim chapter 23. The next pasuk basically talks about having a mikra laila, like if you have a seminal emission at night, and there's always concern for having semen come out for no reason. So that's because of that concern. They're assuming what is nishmarta mikol davar from having thoughts about women. So shelo yistakel adam b'isha na'a va'afilu pnuya be'eshet ish va'afilu mechoeret. Okay, there's two ways to read this line. Again, just like the previous with the O and where you put the comma. A man should not look at a woman, a beautiful woman, even if she's single. Why? Even if she's single, because a married woman is much worse, because the prohibition against marrying a single woman, at least if you're looking at her, maybe you'll end up marrying her. But no, you still shouldn't be looking at single women either like that. And be'eshet ish, even if she's ugly. And a married woman, even if she's ugly, what about a single woman if she's ugly? You can look at her. So some of the commentaries say, no, what this means is even a single woman and obviously a married woman, and either one of them, even if they're ugly, there's two ways to read the sentence. Anyway, or you could say, well, since Shadish is a more severe problem to engage in relations with her, since she's a married woman, maybe her, even if she's ugly, but a non-married woman, maybe it's okay if she's ugly. Anyway, whole interesting thing to think about there, but we're going to move on. I want you to just remember, because later on, after we deal with the sugya for a while, we're going to darshan nishmartim mikol davar ra a second time for a different drasha. And when I got to it, they said, yeah, we already had this pasuk and I had to remember. So I'm telling you, so you remember, where did we have this pasuk? So this pasuk was the drasha. Don't look at a woman, any woman, basically. Turning now to the next page. I'm a bet the low baby date seva shalishan, and not colored clothing of a woman. We're going to talk about this very soon, what this means. V'lo b'chamor, v'lo b'chamura, v'lo b'chazir, v'lo b'chazira, v'lo b'ofop, b'zman shenizkakim ze leseh. Okay, and not animals when they're mating. V'afilu malei einayim kamala. Okay, so right when they're mating, you're basically watching mating in action, and that will make you think of women and having sexual relations. And afilu malei einayim kamala chamavet. Okay, this is a bit of a strange statement. What this means, even full eyes like Malach HaMavet. Some will say Malach HaMavet has a strong desire to kill people. So if you have such a strong desire to look at this woman, you have to stop yourself and not do it, or whatever it is you want to look at, all these things. Or Maloi Naim could be even if there's women on all sides of you and you have nowhere to look otherwise, figure out a way not to look at them. That could be. It's unclear exactly what this means and what its connection is to Malach HaMavet. But the Bright is now going to continue about Malach HaMavet. Okay, so we're going to get tangent off to a bunch of different things, and then the Gemara is going to deal with the different parts of this Bright. But remember, we're still in the question, how did these rabbis look when it says it's clearly forbidden to look? And only at the very end of this section, we're gonna get to the answer. And it's at the end of the Bright. They say the Malach HaMavet is all eyes. Again, not exactly clear what that means. Bishat ptirato shel choleh. So when someone's ready to die, omei me'al meroshav. The Malach HaMavet stands over the head of the sick person. Charbosh l'fav yado. He has a sword in his hand. V'tipa shel marat yabo. When he has a bit of poison dripping from him, like hanging from him. Kevan shecholeh ro'eh oto. And so now imagine the Malach HaMavet is right above the sick person. Sick person sees the Malach HaMavet. Mizdazeh. Gets scared for a moment. Upotech piv. And what do you do when you're scared? You open your mouth. Vizorka letoch piv. And the Malach HaMavet drops that drop of blood, that drop of poison into his mouth, or her mouth. Mimena meit, mimena masriach, mimena panav morikot. That drop of poison causes the death. It causes the putrefying of the body after death. It causes it to smell bad. In those days, they had no freezers or anything, no morgues. And mimena panav morikot, and it causes the face to go green. Okay, so that's the end of that Braita. Now we get back to our answer. So how did those rabbis look at these women and say, wow, how beautiful? Well, Karen Savitavai, they were in a corner, right? They turned a corner and she was there, and they just happened upon her. It wasn't like they were looking at her. It wasn't like they were looking for her. It just kind of happened upon them, and there was nothing they could do to avoid it. Okay, that's an answer that we got. Satisfying or not, I'll leave it to you. Okay. Now we want to understand this colored clothing, and I see already there was a question in the chat about, how do people sell clothes? That's not a problem according to what we're going to see. Now, we're talking about clothing of a woman. We don't mean clothing. Don't look at the woman's clothing when it's on her. That's in really looking at the woman. What we're talking about is clothing, even if it's not on the woman. Okay. And then we get to your question about selling clothes. Amar Rav Papa ubimakil ba'alehen. Rav Papa says this is only if you know whose clothes it is. And then the idea is that the man is looking at the woman's clothes hanging on the line or something and knows the woman who wears the clothes, starts to imagine her in those clothes. That's the problem. And Amarava, Daikanami Dikatane, so now we're going to see it's clothes that belong to someone, so it's not in a store, because a store, the clothes don't belong to anybody. Clothes that belong to someone and you know the person who they belong to. That's when it's a problem. And now Rabbi wants to further prove this. Daikanami Dikatane, velo bibidek tseva shalisha, velo katane, velo bibidek tzivonim. It doesn't say don't look at colored clothing. It says don't look at colored clothing of a woman. Of a woman sounds like of a particular one. So that's Rava's support for Rav Chisda, for Rav Papa. Amar Rav Chisda hanemile ba'atike. Now, even if it belongs to a woman, Rav Chisda says it's only clothes that she's worn already that are old. But if they're brand new clothes that she's never worn, so you see the dress hanging there, you know the woman whose dress it is, but you've never seen it on her. So that's already harder to imagine, right? Only if you've seen her in the outfit, then you know what she looks like in the outfit, so you can imagine you can have a vision of what this looks like, and then that might make you desire the woman. So that's the case. Now, Rav Chisda tries to prove this we're going to have an interesting back and forth here. I find it interesting. So now he says, now I'm going to prove to you that it can't be new clothing because Anan, and this really, if you talked about before, it would have to be new clothing. Certainly it would be okay to sell in a store. And that's why he says this. How do we give our clothes to, like they weren't worried about selling clothes because a lot of people made their own clothes. But when you made your clothes, the last part of the process was you gave it to a launderer and they put it through a process. That person's called an ashpore. And you would give, so let's say I'm a woman, I made my dress and I give it to an ashpore to fix. So what they do is they do some sort of cleaning process that finalizes the dress and makes it ready for use. Now, how could I give it to them? Because, hey, hakam stakel, I bring my dress in, I say, can you make this ready for wear? Now, obviously, this proves, or at least this is what Rav Chisda is trying to say, this proves his point. Because otherwise, you'd never be able to bring it. Here, a woman comes and brings a dress. The ashpure person can imagine the woman in the dress. It would be a problem. So this proves that new clothes are not an issue. To which they respond to him and say, according to what you're saying, though, Had Amar Rav Yehuda, Rav Yehuda says, Min b'mino mutar lachnis k'mechol b'shvofer. Now, how could he say this? Hakam stakel. Okay, what does this mean? Well, a brush into its tube is the way something fits in perfectly one part into another, and it's an image for sexual relations. And what we're talking here is about the animals. If you remember with the animals, you're not allowed to look at animals while they're mating. But Rav Yehuda said if they're two of the same type animals, then you're allowed to mate them. You can't mate right? Two different animals, but you can actually mate them and you can even actively put the male part into the female organ and you can make that happen. Okay, so how can you make that happen? Aren't you looking? Well, what does he say? Ela ba'avidate talmud. Hachanami ba'avidate talmud. Why did Rav Yehuda say you could do that? Because the person is focusing on their job. They're not having thoughts because they're working. While they're working, they're focused very much on their work. They're not thinking about these thoughts. So the same thing for the Ashpori. The reason he's not going to have thoughts about this woman has nothing to do with whether the clothing was ever worn by her or not. That's an irrelevant thing because you don't even need that because he's doing his job. When he's doing a job, he's not thinking about women. So this already also limits the whole thing of the thinking about women. There's certain situations where we're not concerned because you're focused on something else. And if you're doing things for work, right, it's the same, you're focusing on work, then you're not thinking about what these things might cause other people to think about, like gynecologists or something. You could say same kind of thing here, like a male gynecologist, right? They're doing their job. It's not the same kind of thing. So from here, we basically, what did we do? Let's just review until now. We started with what's the source for the halacha in the Mishnah? We said it's lo techanem. We said, wait, but lo techanem means this, it means that. Okay, so we resolved, it means all three. Then we said, actually, one of these issues, giving gifts, is machloket tanaim. Then we got to the don't give them compliments, but these rabbis did give them compliments. And then we said, they give them compliments because they were really not giving compliments to the women. They were just amazed at God and what God could create such beauty. Then we said, how were they looking at these women at all? And we said, they just happened upon them. It wasn't like they were looking for it. It wasn't like they were really looking at them. They just happened to notice while they turned the corner. And then we had to understand, since we got into this Braita, now we're going to explain a few different parts of the Braita. One is this issue of the colored clothing of the women, which we then limited and limited and limited to a bunch of unique cases. Then we're going to go back to this Malach HaMavet. Amar Mimena Meit. Nema Pliga Devoah Deshmua. Now, what this sounds like is, how does the Malach HaMavet kill people? The Malach HaMavet puts a poison in, the person dies. How do you die from poison, right? Something goes on inside and you just die. Well, sounds like he disagrees with the father of Shmuel. It's interesting. We're having a discussion about this one said Malach HaMavet works like this. This one said Malach HaMavet works like that, right? Nobody really knows. But Amar Avodah Shmuel, Amar li Malach HaMavet. Okay, he says, I was told by the angel of death. I had a conversation with him. Right? We've seen people who say, I spoke to this angel or something, right? I think they're just trying to say, I know how this works. Ilo chashina li kari debriyata. Havapana betashchita kebeima. What he said he heard from the Malach HaMavet was like this. If I didn't care about kvoda briot, about respect of human beings, okay, meaning I do care about it, but if I didn't, this is what I would do. I would reveal the neck, like the shchita, where the shchita is done, like we do on animals, right? On animals, you cut it and the whole neck is opened. What Avodah Shmuel, the father of Shmuel, is saying here is the way the Malach HaMavet works is the Malach HaMavet cuts the two simanim, the trachea and the esophagus, just like we do in a shchita, but does it from the inside, and you don't see it on the outside. And the reason you don't see it on the outside is because of kavod briot. So it's not disgusting, and the body's open and for everyone to see. So if I didn't care about kavod briot, I would make an incision in the neck as well, and everyone would see, how vile the death was, and that those two simanim were cut. So now what does it sound like? It sounds like he's saying that how does Malach HaMavet kill? He cuts the trachea and the esophagus. You just don't see it, but that's how he does it. And that's not putting a drop of poison down someone's throat and killing them through the poison. So it sounds like they have a debate here. So now he says, the Gemara answers, no, Dilma hitipa mechat chalul simanim. Who says the poison kills some internal way? Maybe, or by some other way. Maybe when the drop goes in, that drop of poison, it cuts the two simanim. Right? It's not a knife, but it could cut them. It could, cause them to be destroyed or something like that. And maybe it's really one and the same. Okay, Mimena Masriach, Masea Leila Rabbi Chanina Bar Kana. So this tannaitic source supports what Rabbi Chanina Bar Kana said. To Amar Rabbi Chanina Bar Kana, Amar Beirav, if you don't want the body to start smelling bad, you should flip it on its head. Now, why? Because if the Malach HaMavet drops the poison down the throat and you flip it, this is before the person actually dies, flip it, some of the poison might come out and it won't masriach because it's the poison that causes the body to become have this terrible stench to it. Tanu, okay, what you do with all this, I don't know. Tanu Rabbanit. Now I told you to remember because we started at the bottom of Amud Aleph with this pasuk, Nishmarti mikol darara, and now it's all about not looking at a woman. Now we're going off on a tangent because we're bringing something else that's learned from that pasuk, which is similar because both are leading to bad thoughts, and that's as I told you before, because the next pasuk talks about having a seminal emission. Don't think about something during the day that will cause you to have seminal emission at night. We get to a very famous line of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. By the way, I should just mention, so Shuli Mishkan's article is about Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair this week in flashback. And if I forgot to mention, I'm not sure, but Daf Mishalahen is all about lo techanem. Anyway, so content on today's daf. And by the way, in Hebrew, there's a content that went up this week, Sugya B'Ktana of Dr. Meirav Tubal Kahana about Bruya. And also connected to that, she has another series on our site, which is all about women in mitzvot. And she has a series that recently went up about women in Talmud Torah and how women, what's permitted for women to learn. Is it all that? Obviously, she's on the side of women learning Torah. So it's obviously a positive article in that sense. Anyway, so it's just interesting content up there in Hebrew also. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, Nishmarti mikol davara, so you shouldn't think thoughts. Mikan Amar Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. From here, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair made this famous statement, which Mesilat Yesharim, the book, is based on this. Torah mivia lidei zihirut. Torah leads you to being cautious. Zirut mivia lidei zrizut. being cautious brings you to, like being careful, I would say, about keeping mitzvot, keeps you to being zariz about doing mitzvot, doing them quickly, and zrizut, or like excitement about doing them. Zrizut meviali denikiyut, that brings cleanliness. Diligence, which diligence is for zrizut, as you're saying? Is that yeah? Okay. So, and then diligence brings nikiyut, cleanliness, or being clean, like pure kind of clean. Nikiyut maybe lidei prishut. Again, what all these things mean, that's what there's a whole book written on what these things mean and what all these traits are. I'm not going to proclaim to be able to explain them very well right now. Nikiyut brings you to prishut, which is separating from sin. Prishut miviah lidei tahara, that brings you to purity, right? What's the difference between nikiyut and, right, also purity, a form of purity. Tahara miviah lidei chasidut. Okay, being pure brings you to be pious. Chasidut miviah lidei anava. Piety brings you to humility. Anava miviah lidei yirat chet. Humility brings you to fear of sin. Yirat chet miviah lidei kedusha. Fear of sin leads you to holiness. Kedusha miviah lidei ruach hakodesh. Holiness brings you to prophecy. Ruach hakodesh miviah lidei tchiyan hametim. And having ruach hakodesh brings you to tchiyan hametim. The Chasidut Gdola Mikulan. Now we have this machloket. One opinion says Chasidut is the greater than all of them. Shenemar Az Dibarti B'Chazon LaChasidecha. That who does God speak to? His prophets. His prophets are Chasidim. Upliga Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, but disagrees with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Anava Gdola Mikulan. It's actually Anava, humility, that's greater than all. Shenemar Ruach Hashem Elokim Alai Yan Mashach Hashem Oti Levaser Anavim. This is Yeshayahu saying, God sent me to give my word, to spread it to the humble. They're the ones who are going to understand the word of God. Just to point out, there's an interesting Tosfot. We don't have a lot of time, but I just want to point out that Tosfot says, in Yerushalmi and Shkalim, they have the opposite. It's Yirat Chet brings Anava, not Anava brings Yirat Chet. It's a very interesting thing to think about. Right? We don't have much time to delve into all this, but it's interesting to think about. He says, because ever like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the Yerushalmi must hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because Anava Gdola Mikulam, and that it's the Yirat Chet is the goal from there to get to Anava, not that the goal of Anava is to get to Yirat Chet. Something to think about, which is the more important, the more important one. Then he asks a question, but wait, in a different place it says there's three things that are all equal: Yirat Chet, Chochmah, and Anava. They're all the same levels. How do you deal with that? If we have these two approaches, is Yirat Chet more important than Anava? This says they're all equal. So he says what they really mean is you can't have one without the other. You can't have wisdom without Yirah. You can't have Yirah without wisdom. You can't have either one without humility. Interesting to think about. Okay. Tough. And now we're back to where we started. So we started with what's the source for the halacha in the Mishnah, which we said is lo techanem, and from there we got off on all these other tangents. Now, okay, and that we've kind of done the summary for that part. Now we're going to finish up with Machloket Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. So first, we're going to do two things here. The first one is Tanu Rabbanan. We're going to bring a braita that basically says they have the same machloket as we said in the Mishnah, but it's going to basically bring three cases, and then we're going to say, why do we need all three? So we're going to have three things that are attached to the ground that seem kind of all one and the same. So the first is the tree. Rabbi Yehuda says you can sell them a tree as long as they say, I'm going to cut it. And Rabbi Meir says, you can only sell it if it's cut. That's why I said Rabbi Meir is Tanakam in our Mishnah based on this. Shachat. Okay, that's animal fodder. Amanat ligzoz v'gozez. Rabbi Yehuda, you can sell it as long as they say we're planning to cut it. Rabbi Meir only if it's cut. Kama, a field full of wheat or grains. Amanat liksol v'kotzer. Rabbi Yehuda, right? On the intent that they're going to cut it, and they can cut it, and it's theirs. Rabbi Meir no, you can only sell it if it's cut. So, sricha, why do we need all three cases? They're all really the same. Well, not really. Yes, an ilan. If you just had a tree, you would say bahakama Rabbi Meir. Kevan de lo pasid mashele. It's not going to go bad over time, right? The crops are going to rot at a certain point. So you're going to want to cut them. So it makes sense if I'm selling them, if they're going to cut, they're clearly going to cut it. So maybe Rabbi Meir would agree with Rabbi Yehuda in that case, but not a tree where it doesn't need to be cut. So that's what we might have thought. Ella, but the wheat, when it comes, it might get rotten. Rabbi Yehuda. So maybe they agree with Rabbi Yehuda that likely they're going to cut it because otherwise it'll rot anyway. But if you had the field of wheat and you had the case of the tree, you would say Mishum Velo Yediah Shibchai. Leaving it in the ground, it's not so clear what exactly the benefits are. It's not a measurable benefit to leave it in the ground. Aval Shacha Yediah Shibchayu. But if you leave fodder in the ground, it's just going to get taller. You're going to have more animal fodder. It's going to grow and grow. So it's very clear. You're going to see in a few weeks, it's bigger than it was a few weeks ago. So there's a motivation for the Gentile to keep it in the ground, which means he's more suspect that he's not going to sell it, that he's not going to cut it. So maybe Rabbi Meir, maybe Rabbi Yehuda agreed with Rabbi Meir. In that case, we have to be concerned. So that's why you need all these cases, right? What if you just had the fodder case? Again, same logic. Rabbi Meir. If you just had the fodder case, you might say that's what Rabbi Meir doesn't trust the Gentile to cut it because it's in their best interest to keep it in the ground. But in the others, maybe he agrees with Rabbi Yehuda that you would trust the Gentile. Sricha. That's what you need to know. They disagree across the board. And now we're going to go one more. Do they disagree across the board, even in a different case? And I mentioned this in the beginning of Daf. Is this all just, do we trust them or do we not trust them? Is that what's going on here? So does it apply also if you sell an animal for the purposes of slaughtering, which theoretically should be okay? But the question is, what if they're not going to necessarily slaughter it? Hatam tam amai shari Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe there, in our case, Rabbi Yehuda permits to la birshute kaime velo mate mashilu. Aval behema kevan de birshute de ove kochavim kaima mashule. In the case where I sell you a Gentile a tree, the tree is in my property, so it's not in the Gentile's property. So therefore, it's likely the Gentile, if I sold it so that the Gentile cut it, I can make sure they cut it, and they're not going to not cut it because they know I see it all the time and it's in my property. But the animal, they take into their own property. So they say, yeah, I'm buying it to slaughter. But the next day they go home and they use the animal in their field. And I'm not going to see, or even if I do see, what rights do I have to go into their property and start telling them, what are you doing? So maybe there's a difference. Odil Meloshna, or maybe there's no difference, which the Gemara ends with, Tashma, let's learn it from here. Tanya, as it says in the Braita, behema menat lishchot v'shochet, divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir Omer, ein mochrim lo ela shchuta. Meir says if he wants to buy it for slaughtering, you have to slaughter it. You can't give it to him unslaughtered because we don't trust them. And Rabbi Yehuda says we trust them. So you see that this is a general across the board. Rabbi Yehuda's approach is, I don't trust them if I make a sale. And then the question is this in general? Is it specifically because they're a Gentile or not? That's a good question. That's not clear. And Rabbi Yehuda in general says if that's the stipulation of the agreement, then you can assume that they're going to go through with the agreement. So with that, we end today, and that sums up the main point of our daf, even though we ended up on a lot of other tangents about other things based on the three issues of lo techanem. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.